The world is moving in a direction most people can't see, because the signs don't reveal themselves loudly at first. Every major collapse in history started quietly, almost gently, like a whisper before the storm. At first, things look normal. Markets are rising, banks are stable, governments are assuring everyone that growth is strong and the future is secure. But behind the curtain, a different story is being written. A story of pressure, imbalance, and decisions that will eventually reshape everything. What we are living through right now isn't an accident. It's part of a pattern, one that has repeated constantly through history, from ancient empires to modern superpowers, from the gold standard collapse to the credit crisis of 2008. The same forces are building up again today, and most people have no idea what's coming. Every collapse begins with pressure nobody notices. Governments start taking on debt, thinking it will never catch up with them. Consumers spend more than they earn, believing tomorrow will fix everything. Corporations use borrowed money to create the illusion of success. Slowly, the entire system becomes dependent on cheap money, easy credit, and constant expansion. But expansion has limits. Confidence has limits. Patience has limits. And when those limits are crossed, the entire structure begins to shake. We are living in the late stages of a cycle that has played out dozens of times across centuries, and each time, the ending has been the same. The signs are here for anyone who knows where to look. Inflation rising faster than wages, forcing families to survive by cutting essentials. Interest rates climbing to levels that choke economic growth. Banks tightening lending standards as defaults quietly increase. Currencies losing value as governments print more money to pay old debts. The stock market rising not because the economy is strong, but because speculation is out of control. These are not random events. They are symptoms of a system reaching its breaking point. The last time these patterns appeared together was before major downturns. The Great Depression, the 1970s stagflation, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial meltdown, and now the same signals are flashing again. But the truth is, the system doesn't collapse because of a single spark. It collapses because the foundation has been rotting for years. When people say, the crash came out of nowhere, it never did. It was always building, piece by piece, quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. Most people don't notice until the very moment everything starts falling apart. Big money notices early. Hedge funds reposition. Billionaires shift assets. Corporations quietly move capital offshore. And by the time the public realizes something is wrong, the smart players have already moved to safety. The entire financial world runs on confidence. It's the invisible glue that holds markets, currencies, banks, and governments together. When confidence is strong, even weak systems look stable. But when confidence disappears, even the strongest systems collapse. A single bank failure can trigger panic. A downgrade in government debt can freeze credit markets. A sudden drop in the stock market can erase years of savings. Once fear begins, it spreads faster than any virus, across borders and continents, through banks, corporations, and households. Confidence takes years to build, but only seconds to die. And when it dies, the consequences reshape everything. Jobs vanish. Businesses shut down. Prices fluctuate wildly. People rush to pull their money out of banks. Governments try to restore order with emergency measures, printing more money, freezing withdrawals, injecting liquidity, blaming foreign events. But by then, the damage is already done. A reset begins, not a reset announced publicly, but a silent rebalancing of power and wealth. Assets change hands. Weak players get wiped out. Strong players buy everything at a discount. Wealth doesn't disappear, it transfers. And it always transfers from the unprepared to the prepared. This phase of the cycle is where the greatest opportunities exist, but only for those who understand what's happening. History shows that crises have always created new fortunes. The people who studied the patterns, who understood the warnings, who acted early, these are the ones who came out stronger. Meanwhile, the people who ignored the signs paid the price. The system is shifting again, and the next chapter will decide who rises and who falls. You cannot control the global economy. You cannot control central banks, inflation, or market cycles. But you can control how much you understand. You can control how early you prepare. You can control whether you become a victim of the next collapse, or a survivor who uses knowledge as power. The choice is always yours. The cycle is entering its final stage, and once it completes, the world will not return to what it was. A new chapter is coming, and if you want to navigate it, you must see the system for what it truly is, not what you are told it is. If you want to dive deeper into how these cycles form, how they break, and how you can position yourself before the turning point arrives, stay tuned, because the story isn't ending, it's just beginning. The global economic system is quietly moving toward a collapse that follows historical patterns. And the most striking part is that it never arrives with a dramatic warning or a sudden explosion. It always begins in silence, with small movements that almost no one pays attention to. The world today is experiencing the same subtle shifts that appeared before every major economic breakdown in history. Markets are rising in ways that don't match real economic strength. Governments are borrowing more than ever before, and people continue to trust a system that has been weakened from within. The illusion of stability convinces the public that everything is fine, but beneath that illusion, deeper forces are shaping a different future. These forces include inflation that reduces the value of money, interest rates that strain households, and global debt levels that have never been seen before. What makes this cycle dangerous is not only the numbers, but the mindset that accompanies them. People believe the system will fix itself, because it always has in their lifetime, but cycles stretch beyond one generation. When you zoom out and look at centuries of history, you see that every empire, every financial structure, every monetary system eventually reaches a breaking point, not because of one event, but because of accumulated stress that becomes impossible to ignore. What's happening now mirrors those same patterns. The economy looks strong on the surface, yet the strength is artificial, supported by stimulus, debt, and policies that cannot be sustained forever. Governments assure the public that inflation is under control, that the markets are healthy, and that growth will continue, but history shows that official reassurances always sound the loudest right before a major shift. The build-up to collapse always feels like calmness, because people don't see the pressure forming beneath them. Meanwhile, financial institutions, global markets, and governments have become interconnected to a point where one failure can ripple instantly across continents. This interconnectedness creates a fragile system where a shock in one part of the world can trigger a chain reaction elsewhere. The signs are appearing just as they did before past collapses: rising debt, declining purchasing power, unstable housing markets, and speculative bubbles driven more by emotion than reality. The world today is not experiencing something new, it is experiencing something old repeating itself. Economic systems follow cycles of boom, expansion, decline, and collapse, and while the details change with time, the pattern stays the same. What makes this moment critical is how much more extreme the cycle has become. Debt levels are higher, markets are more inflated, and global reliance on printed money has reached historic levels. This means that when the cycle turns, the impact will not be limited to a single country or sector. It will be global. Most people won't recognize the shift until it is already happening, because collapses never announce themselves. They arrive quietly, slowly, and then all at once. The script reflects this reality by showing that the world is now standing at the edge of a familiar financial pattern that has repeated across centuries and civilizations, and understanding this pattern is the first step toward understanding what comes next. Hidden pressures like debt, inflation, and speculation are building beneath the surface and are being ignored because they do not create immediate pain, and that is what makes them so dangerous. These pressures grow slowly, almost invisibly, and because they don't cause instant disruption, governments, businesses, and ordinary people underestimate them. Debt, for example, increases quietly year after year, and each time a government borrows more, the public becomes more numb to the numbers. What once seemed alarming becomes normal, and what becomes normal is no longer questioned. But debt is not just a number on a balance sheet. It is a weight on the entire financial system. When governments borrow too much, they eventually lose the ability to stimulate the economy without creating more problems. When corporations rely on borrowed money to show growth, they inflate their own value artificially. When households live on credit, their future income is already spent. These layers of debt sit like hidden cracks under a building, widening slowly until the structure cannot hold itself anymore. Inflation adds another layer of pressure that most people misunderstand. It doesn't need to rise rapidly to be damaging. Even steady inflation silently erodes the purchasing power of every currency in the world. As prices rise and wages fail to keep up, families stretch their budgets thinner. Essentials like food, energy, and housing become harder to afford, creating stress that doesn't show up on financial charts, but builds within society. The dangerous part is that inflation becomes normalized as well. People complain about prices but adjust their lives around them, and by adjusting, they unconsciously accept that the system is failing them. Governments try to control inflation by raising interest rates, but those higher rates create another problem. They make borrowing more expensive. Businesses cut investment, consumers reduce spending, and housing markets weaken. A single attempt to fix one pressure creates another, showing how deeply interlocked and fragile the system has become. Speculation is the final pressure building beneath the surface, and it grows fastest when people believe nothing can go wrong, when stock markets rise beyond logic, when housing prices disconnect from wages, when people rush into assets not because they understand them but because they fear missing out. Speculation becomes a force strong enough to override reality. The system becomes driven not by fundamentals but by emotion, hope, and greed. This is the same pattern that preceded the dot-com crash, the 2008 housing collapse, and numerous market bubbles throughout history. People invest wildly, assuming the rise will never end, and by the time they realize the market is inflated beyond its true value, it is already too late. Speculation creates temporary wealth but long-term instability, and once the emotional momentum stops, the reversal can be brutal. All these pressures, debt, inflation, speculation, do not appear isolated. They feed into each other, amplify each other, and accelerate together. The danger comes from how quietly they grow and how easily they are dismissed. Governments continue printing money to cover debts, which fuels inflation. Inflation pushes people towards speculative investments as they try to protect their savings, which inflates bubbles. When the bubbles grow too large, even a small shock can cause everything to unravel. The public sees only pieces, but these pieces form a single system moving toward a predictable breaking point. Understanding these hidden pressures is essential because they reveal that the collapse doesn't begin when everything falls apart. It begins long before, silently, when no one is paying attention. The system's foundation is weakening, and major players quietly prepare long before the public notices, because those who truly understand how the financial world works know that collapses do not happen suddenly. They unfold gradually beneath the surface. Banks, hedge funds, and large institutions are not guided by emotion like ordinary investors. They watch patterns, measure risks, and react long before the average person even senses a problem. When they detect pressure in the system, they begin shifting their positions quietly, reducing exposure to risky assets, increasing liquidity, and protecting themselves from potential shocks. This behavior is not announced on television or explained in news articles. It happens silently, through subtle movements in capital flows, asset allocations, and internal risk models. By the time the public starts noticing headlines about instability, these large players have already moved miles ahead, shielding themselves while the average person remains exposed. The weakening foundation becomes visible first, through changes in how institutional money behaves. When corporate insiders sell more shares than they buy, it signals a lack of confidence in their own companies. When banks tighten lending standards even during periods of apparent economic growth, it indicates they see danger ahead. When global investors shift money into safer assets like bonds, commodities, or defensive sectors, it shows they expect turbulence. These shifts rarely gain public attention because they do not create immediate headlines, but they reveal a growing belief among insiders that the system is no longer stable. The foundation they once trusted is cracking, and instead of warning the public, they quietly prepare for impact. This pattern has repeated in every major downturn. Before the 2008 crash, insiders sold shares at record levels. Before the dot-com burst, institutional money began rotating out months in advance. Before currency crises in emerging markets, foreign investors quietly exited. The public, unaware of these signs, continued behaving normally until the storm arrived. As the system weakens further, the actions of major players become more strategic. They diversify out of vulnerable currencies, move money to regions with stronger fiscal positions, reduce leverage, and increase their exposure to hard assets or safe havens. This preparation is never loud, because panic hurts them too, so silence becomes part of their strategy. Meanwhile, the public is encouraged to remain optimistic, reassured by positive narratives, and kept unaware of the deeper structural issues. Central banks speak confidently, politicians promise stability, and financial media focuses on short-term market movements instead of long-term risks. This disconnect between insider behavior and public belief widens over time, creating a dangerous gap where reality drifts far from perception. Eventually, when the system becomes fragile enough, even a small shock can create a chain reaction. Big players are already prepared, positioned to survive or even benefit from the downturn, while ordinary families, small businesses, and inexperienced investors face the full impact. The weakening foundation is not just a financial issue, it is a psychological and social one. Confidence keeps the system together, but once insiders lose that confidence, collapse becomes inevitable. The public remains unaware until the effects spill into their daily lives. Jobs lost, savings wiped, markets crashing, and prices rising uncontrollably. By the time the truth becomes obvious, the insiders have already stepped aside, protected by the early moves the public never saw. This cycle demonstrates why understanding insider behavior is essential. The collapse doesn't start when people panic. It starts when the smartest players quietly walk away.